The Last Supper is the subject of numerous icons and paintings, the most famous of which is Leonardo da Vinci's monumental mural in the refectory of the Dominican monastery of Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan. It was commissioned by Leonardo's patron, Duke Ludovico Sforza. Initially, Leonardo intended to create a more traditional depiction. Typically, in scenes of the Last Supper, Judas is seated separately from the others, or reaching for a dish on the table, while John leans toward Jesus in fear that he might be the traitor. However, Da Vinci deviated from these conventions. He placed all the participants on one side of the table, making it initially unclear which apostle is depicted where. At the same time, Leonardo infused the scene with deep psychological insight. Each participant reacts to the events with their own emotion. Leonardo's The Last Supper represents a significant break from tradition, moving away from static, symmetrical compositions of sacred figures toward a psychological drama, a scene filled with emotional intensity and brilliant storytelling. As we discussed in the previous video about the Mona Lisa, Leonardo was not just an artist. He was an artist among other things. His scope of work was vast, and this breadth is reflected in his paintings. Leonardo's The Last Supper is much more than a depiction of the final meal of Jesus Christ and his disciples. It provides insight into the mind of a Renaissance genius who used science, mathematics, and theater to explore the timeless themes of betrayal, faith, and redemption. One aspect of Leonardo's work that is rarely discussed is his involvement in theater, which is crucial when discussing his paintings. As the master of festivities at the Duke's court, Leonardo developed, organized, and directed productions for festival parades, triumphal processions, masquerades, knightly tournaments, and plays, for which he choreographed performances, designed and decorated sets and props, and even created costumes. He collaborated with poets, playwrights, and musicians to bring these grand visions to life. On canvas, he employed the same comprehensive skills in observation, knowledge of light, movement, and perspective as he did on stage. Many Renaissance artists and other historical painters took on additional roles beyond their primary artistic work, especially when serving royal or noble courts. We know that Leonardo was a specialist in various fields, and while this might seem unusual today, for him and other Renaissance artists, these were not separate specialties but deeply interconnected disciplines. We can view the Mona Lisa as a great work of art, but he would see it also as a work of science, geometry, and philosophy. He firmly believed that studying one discipline enriched the understanding of others. In theater, he combined art, mechanics, and design. He created intricate rotating sets, mechanical devices, and props that showcased his engineering genius. He designed mechanisms that allowed characters to fly or emerge from underground, adding a magical element to the performances. He created devices that could mimic natural phenomena, such as storms and waves. He understood not only how perspective works on a three-dimensional stage, but also how it appears from different viewpoints. And all this work and skills became the foundation for the greatest theatrical production in his career. The Last Supper. The Last Supper is located in the refectory of the Santa Maria del Grazie monastery in Milan, Italy. The refectory was long and narrow, 35 meters in length and 9 meters in width, and was furnished with 2 long tables where the monks ate in silent reflection. The only source of light was the high windows on the western wall. Apart from a crucifix on one of the plain plastered walls, before which they prayed before meals, there was no decoration, which was standard for the ascetic lifestyle of the Dominican order. Since the middle of the 14th century, monasteries and convents began commissioning frescoes on the walls of their refectories to enjoy during meals. The theme of these frescoes was usually the miracle of the loaves and fishes, but more often it was the Last Supper, giving monks the opportunity to break bread in the presence of Jesus and his disciples doing the same. Leonardo painted the Last Supper on the north wall of the refectory over 3 years, from 1495 to 1498. On the south wall, directly opposite the Last Supper, is the fresco Crucifixion by Giovanni Donato Montalfano. It thematically echoes the Last Supper, creating a powerful contrast between the sacrifice foretold at the supper and its fulfillment on the cross. In fact, if we look at the crucifixion from Christ's perspective, he is looking directly at the continuation of the story after the Last Supper. He sees his own crucifixion the next day. Monterfano began working on his crucifixion simultaneously with Leonardo, but likely completed it within a few months, as he used the traditional fresco technique, unlike Leonardo. This is why Monterfano's work has not only survived more than 500 years, but also looks as if it were painted yesterday. What we see when looking at the Last Supper is a ghost of the original painting. The exact percentage of Leonardo's original work in the Last Supper is difficult to determine, but some art historians believe that only about 20 to 25% of Leonardo's original painting has survived. Much of the painting has been severely damaged, excessively restored, or lost over the centuries due to Leonardo's experimental technique, environmental exposure, and poor conservation conditions. Usually, such works were created using the fresco technique, where drawings were quickly applied to wet plaster, hence the term fresco, meaning fresh in Italian. When the plaster dries, the pigments are absorbed and chemically bond to the wall surface, creating a very durable coating that can last for centuries without restoration under proper conditions. The downside is that artists must work very quickly while the plaster is still wet, usually completing sections within one day. Making corrections or changes is difficult after the plaster dries. Another drawback is that some colors couldn't be used because the plaster contained lime, and some pigments, such as ultramarine, couldn't withstand the alkalinity. Leonardo's teacher in Florence, Verrocchio, was a sculptor, painter, and jeweler, but was not a master of fresco. His painting technique was limited to working with tempera on wooden panels, and this is what Leonardo learned as his apprentice. Tempera is a fast-drying paint made by mixing pigments with a water-soluble binder, usually egg yolk. Leonardo was never known for his speed, so the Last Supper took 3 years. The fresco technique was too limiting for his detailed and subtle style and his slow, thoughtful approach. It didn't allow for precise color mixing and layering, like his signature play of light and shadow, or chiaroscuro. Therefore, he used an experimental technique for the Last Supper, combining tempera and oil paints on a dry plaster surface. Essentially, Leonardo attempted to make an oil painting on a wall, and this was a major mistake because the dry plaster did not absorb the paint as well as the wet plaster in a true fresco. The wall surface was also vulnerable to environmental effects, such as humidity and temperature changes from the kitchen behind the wall. If it had been a true fresco, it would have allowed moisture to pass through the wall, but since it did not, the paint began to flake. Just 20 years later, the Last Supper began to fade significantly, requiring extensive conservation efforts over the centuries. Fortunately for us, several copies of the Last Supper on canvas were made by Leonardo da Vinci's students and contemporaries during his lifetime. These versions play an important role in understanding Leonardo's original intent and are valuable tools for art historians and restorers. They preserve details, colors, and compositional elements that have disappeared from the original work over time. A nearly life-sized copy by Giampietrino, believed to have been painted around 1515 by one of his students, shows details no longer visible in Leonardo's work, although it lacks the upper third. Leonardo was not a very religious person, yet he created one of the most significant depictions of the Last Supper of Jesus and the 12 Apostles. We must start with the biblical story to see what is represented here. The Last Supper appears in all 4 Gospels of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in more or less the same sequence of events. Leonardo depicts the moment of Christ's announcement that one of the disciples is a traitor. "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me," setting in motion the events leading to the crucifixion. But Leonardo also creates a liturgical message, with Christ reaching for the bread and wine, about to declare that the bread represents his body and the wine his blood, thus establishing the institution of the Eucharist, the Christian celebration of the sacrifice of Christ's body. The betrayal of Christ by one of his disciples is just the most obvious part of this painting. Leonardo's genius lies in the fact that he not only shows a moment in the narrative and not just a liturgical message, but he also weaves much more into the story. The earliest Last Supper dates back to the 6th century, and Leonardo saw many interpretations of this story in Florence. Most of these images follow the Gospel of John, which is the only one of the 4 Gospels that mentions John resting on Christ's chest, becoming an important part of the iconography of Last Supper images for centuries, up to Leonardo. It is a complex scene to display correctly, to show 13 characters at the table in a coherent manner. Often they are crowded together to fit everyone, making it difficult to view them as separate individuals. It was always obvious who Christ was and who John was next to him. And Judas was easily identified among the 12 disciples, as he was the only one without a halo. But the other disciples were sometimes interchangeable, lacking emotions and individuality. This Last Supper from Florence, created 50 years before Leonardo began his, has a fine sense of three-dimensional space, but lacks any sense of drama. The apostles look extremely relaxed, and one is even reading a book. Other representations followed a static orderly arrangement, with Christ again surrounded, and the apostles lined up one behind the other like chess pieces, separated and devoid of individual emotional expressions. Leonardo decided to simplify the scene by placing it in a rather austere room, in line with Dominican aesthetics, and turning it into a story of human drama, elevating it from a religious narrative to a psychological study of human beings struggling with fear, confusion, guilt, and betrayal. He does not create drama for drama's sake. In the Bible, it's a very dramatic scene. 13 friends sit down for a meal in an occupied city, whose guards are waiting to arrest and execute their charismatic leader. One of their group is working with the enemy to betray a friend, preparing to unleash a devastating chain of events. It is a scene imbued with the knowledge of what is to come. If we compare these 2 Last Suppers, which are only 20 years apart, we can see how Leonardo gives the scene the dramatic expressiveness it deserves. In this early sketch, the artist is trying to work out the logistics, but is still considering the standard layout, with Judas clearly on the other side of the table. But ultimately, he rejected the usual formula and created something new. He did this by applying both mathematical ideas and theatrical knowledge to a clear, well-organized structure. First, he utilized the principle of perspective, and then organized the apostles into 4 groups of 3 to create a balanced and structured foundation. Their overlapping figures also create spatial layers, adding depth to the image. This clear composition allowed him to introduce dynamic interaction into the scene, depicting the apostles emotionally and physically reacting to Christ's announcement of betrayal. In the artwork, where some characters are hidden behind a long table, only faces and hand movements remain visible. This became the ideal embodiment of what Leonardo described as the movement of the soul. In other words, how external manifestations of the human body, such as facial expressions, gestures, and postures, convey internal emotions and psychological states. How can we identify each figure in this painting? Typically, saints are distinguished by unique symbols or signs. For example, the Apostle Peter holds keys. These were the keys to the kingdom of heaven, which, as stated in the Gospel of Matthew, Christ himself granted him. Whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Often, the attributes of a holy martyr became the instruments of his torture and execution, or severed parts of his body. In other cases, a saint is accompanied by animals that miraculously fed him, or appeared to him in visions, or attributes of a profession he pursued in life, or a profession whose representatives he now patronizes. Thus, the Apostle Paul is depicted with a sword, as he was beheaded. Saint Sebastian is depicted with arrows, sometimes with many arrows, as he was killed with arrows by the Romans. Saint Catherine of Alexandria is depicted with a wheel, as she was tortured on a wheel, Saint Agatha with severed breasts, Saint Apollonia of Alexandria with tongs and teeth. But Leonardo does not use attributes, and the only indicator here is Judas holding a bag of coins. How do we identify who is who among the saints? Fortunately, in 1807, a 16th-century fresco was discovered in a small church in Switzerland. It was a copy, almost certainly created by someone who knew Leonardo or his circle, and all 13 names were signed at the bottom. The first thing that stands out in Leonardo's version is the absence of halos. By removing traditional markers of divinity such as halos, Leonardo created a scene grounded in life and built upon human emotions, emphasizing the humanity of Christ and the apostles. Devoid of their religious identifiers, each figure in the four groups is fully developed and uniquely characterized, creating a sense of narrative and movement not seen in earlier works on this subject. The goal was to focus on faces and reactions. We can read the four groups of three from left to right, not as something frozen in time, but as waves of reactions stemming from Christ's announcement. In the first triad on the left, James the Lesser, Andrew, and Bartholomew all react to what Christ has just said, exclaiming, as the Bible states, "Lord, is it I?" Much of their emotions are conveyed through expressive hands, which is not surprising, as Leonardo was Italian, and hand gestures are an integral part of his culture. He dedicated countless hours to studying the structure and movement of hands, and made numerous sketches from life. One of his sketches of St. John's hands shows them folded, which Leonardo noted as a sign of sorrow, and this is a clear reference to other depictions of St. John, including the Crucifixion of Monferrato on the opposite wall. The next group, consisting of Judas, Peter, and John, is key. Peter holds a knife and asks John about whom Christ speaks, and here he is ready to act. The knife in Peter's hand hints at the gospel story of his impulsive act later in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he drew a sword to protect Jesus from arrest and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. This action demonstrates Peter's loyalty, but also his impulsive and aggressive nature, perfectly captured by Leonardo. The position of the knife is also interesting as it points to Bartholomew, who would later be flayed alive by barbarians, and is often depicted with a knife, the instrument of his torture, as well as with flayed skin. Judas in this scene is almost always on the opposite side of the table from the others, to signify his betrayal and separation from the other apostles, the obvious villain. However, by including Judas among the others, Leonardo emphasizes his humanity, showing that betrayal comes not from an outsider, but from within Christ's close circle of followers, enhancing the drama. This nuance in depicting Judas and the complexity of moral choice foreshadows what we will later see in Caravaggio. Leonardo's depiction reflects a shift in theological focus, artistic styles, and cultural attitudes toward Judas's role in the narrative. Instead of separating him from the group, Judas's posture and behavior distinguish him in Leonardo's work. He leans back, clutching a small bag of 30 silver coins received for the betrayal, and his face is the only one in the group turning away, both literally and figuratively, from the light falling from the left, plunging his face into shadows to convey guilt and secrecy. This subtle distinction achieves the effect of isolation without physically separating him from the group. Judas's neck, turned toward us, is a reminder that he will hang himself, filled with shame and remorse. Leonardo's handling of light and color is, of course, masterful. He uses light just as he does perspective, to create the impression that the two dining rooms are one and the same space. The light in The Last Supper and its direction mimic the natural lighting coming through the actual windows of the refectory. The shadows and highlights on the figures correspond to the direction of light in the real room. For example, Judas's left hand, as he reaches for the bowl, is illuminated, and the sleeve catches the light, which is reflected in a change of shade. All of this enhances the realism and coherence of the scene, linking the monk's meal with the sacred narrative. Salt appears many times in the Bible, both in the Old and New Testaments, and in the painting, we see that when Judas recoils, he knocks over the salt shaker, a detail lost in the original but visible in a copy. Spilled salt was often associated with misfortune, betrayal, or bad luck, aligning with Judas's role as Christ's betrayer. This is still considered a bad omen in many countries, and Leonardo's painting almost certainly popularized the superstition. John, the beloved disciple of Christ, is traditionally considered the youngest of the apostles. This depiction shows him, as always, beardless to signify his youth. He is often depicted with soft, delicate features culturally associated with youth, and in turn, femininity. During the Renaissance, many artists stylized male and female figures with similar androgynous characteristics to emphasize idealized beauty. As discussed, in most previous depictions of the Last Supper, John is shown resting his head on the Savior's chest, as stated in the Gospel of John, to underscore his special status as Christ's beloved disciple. Leonardo changes this, and instead, he is shown almost as a mirror reflection of Christ, but leans toward Peter, who in the next part of the story whispers to John about whom he speaks, causing Judas to recoil. The artist wanted Christ to be separated, and the center of the painting clearly defined. This composition adds tension, further isolating Christ, and if John leaned toward him, it would weaken the composition. Christ is the spiritual center of the scene, solitary and calm, while emotional chaos swirls around him. This makes the message much more powerful in a clear visualization than when he is often depicted in a crowd with others. He has just spoken the words of betrayal, his mouth still slightly open, and he silently lowers his head. He is calm, and his hands are in a familiar pose that foreshadows his wounds on the cross. Christ's hands play an important role in the perception of the painting. They form an equilateral triangle, drawing attention to the center. An equilateral triangle is inherently a stable shape. It gives the figure of Christ a sense of order and balance, in contrast to the other gesturing characters. His left hand reaches for the bread, drawing our attention to the diagonal of his left arm and his lowered gaze directed at the bread. Our eyes look exactly where Leonardo has guided us. It was a remarkable theatrical move. The monks entering the refectory would first notice Christ's hand extended towards them. In the original version, the light falling on Judas's hand also fell on Christ's hand. Since there are no halos in this painting, Leonardo used light and composition to emphasize Christ's divinity. The natural light from the three windows behind him makes the hand the brightest part of the painting, contrasting with the warmer tones of the interior. By creating a clear visual separation between the earthly and divine worlds, Leonardo metaphorically links Christ with light, symbolizing divinity, purity, and salvation. Then there is the pediment, which emphasizes the spiritual significance of Christ without using explicit symbolism. In the biblical story, after Christ's words about betrayal, each of the disciples asks, "Lord, is it I?" We see Philip pointing to himself. Jesus replies, "The one who dipped his hand into the dish with me will betray me." We see only two people reaching for something on the table. Jesus reaches for the wine, and Judas for the bread. To the right of Jesus are James the Greater, Thomas, and Philip. Thomas, who looks very focused, raises his index finger. This gesture can be seen in other works by Leonardo and may signify the divine authority of Christ, but it may also foreshadow Thomas's role in the gospel narrative, where he doubts Christ's resurrection until he touches his wounds. In the last group are Matthew, Simon, and Thaddeus. They have already processed what they heard and are now hotly discussing Christ's words. Thaddeus and Matthew seem to be pointing at Judas, sitting at the other end of the table, and both turn to Simon for advice, whose composure suggests he is a figure of stability and reason in the group. Simon, sitting on one side, and Bartholomew, sitting on the other, frame the scene while conveying the energy and emotion emanating from the center of the composition. Leonardo's deep study of optics gave him a complete understanding of perspective. The rediscovery of the mathematical system for representing three-dimensional objects and space on a two-dimensional surface revolutionized Italian art in the 15th century, and Leonardo quickly became a master of it. We must mention Leonardo's use of one-point perspective in the Last Supper, which converges precisely at Christ's right temple. The central position of Christ is important as a technical device, a psychological element, and a liturgical focus that will be immortalized in the Christian Mass. To achieve this, Leonardo first applied a base layer of lead white, then drove a nail into the wall, attached a piece of string to the nail, and made marks where the lines radiated to use them as a guide when planning the painting. In fact, we can still see the mark where Leonardo drove the nail into the wall. Everything is designed to make you look at Christ, who anchors the scene. If we take the cornice above Christ, the only curved line in the architecture, we can draw a circle that appears in the center of the painting and perfectly encompasses Christ. He is the center of everything. This is a clear spiritual message conveyed through mathematics. Due to its enormous size, the painting will be seen differently from various viewpoints in the refectory. Leonardo places the vanishing point 15 feet, or 4.5 meters above the refectory floor, which aligns precisely with the perspective lines of the dining hall, and extends the frame into the refectory, as if Jesus and his disciples were in the room dining with the monks. This was particularly impressive in a relatively narrow dining hall, where the illusion of extended space would be very striking. How you saw the perspective of the imaginary room also depended on which door you entered through. This works from that perspective as well. These effects are designed to make the Last Supper an extension of the monk's dining room, reducing the boundary between art and reality. Leonardo also uses tricks as a solution to the problem of creating three-dimensional space on a flat surface. The table is too narrow for 13 people to dine at and too long for the room. But visually, it simply works as a separation between the earthly world, the refectory, and the heavenly, Christ, and his disciples. Leonardo's knowledge of theatrical art, his technical mastery, and meticulous observation of human behavior are evident in every detail of the painting, from the expressive gestures of the characters to the architectural precision that frames the scene. It is a remarkable combination of art, theology, storytelling, and theater. The Last Supper is not just an artistic achievement, but a profound philosophical reflection on betrayal, faith, and humanity. We hope that this video has helped you better understand and appreciate this masterpiece. To further comprehend the uniqueness of Leonardo's approach, you can find a video on our channel about how different artists have interpreted the theme of the Last Supper. You can also watch my video analyzing the psychological reactions of the apostles, based on Goethe's essay. And in the video about Van Gogh, you will find an unexpected review of one of his paintings with hidden references to the Leonardo's Last Supper. Don't miss the chance to uncover this art historical mystery. And of course, hurry to unravel the mystery of the Mona Lisa with your art pastor. Like, leave comments, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new captivating stories from the world of art. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Your art pastor.